I'm not usually applauded as an attorney, but I'll be very brief. As Director Forbes mentioned, in 2007, the Planning Board studied the area to determine whether it met the qualifications to be determined to be an area in need of redevelopment under the state statute. It concluded that it did and made a recommendation to the governing body, to the City Council, that the area be declared to be in need of redevelopment. I mention this because you can't have a redevelopment plan until you first have that step taken. And with respect to the Planning Board recommendation, there was something somewhat unusual included in the recommendation to the governing body, and that is that the Planning Board said that the City Council should seriously consider that the property owners be provided the opportunity to redevelop the sites. That's not the case all the time with redevelopment. When the City Council got that recommendation from the Planning Board to declare the area in need of redevelopment and the recommendation about the yielding to the property owners to develop the properties they own, the City Council did two things. It accepted the recommendation, declared the area to be in need of redevelopment, and also expressed the policy judgment that it wanted the plan to provide that the property owners be allowed to develop the property that they own. And now the draft plan that is in front of you carries through that theme, which explicitly says that the recommendations of both the Planning Board and the governing body in 2007 are accepted in the plan, this draft plan, and that the property owners will be given the opportunity to develop their sites. That means that this plan does not include an opportunity for condemnation of properties or eminent domain, as sometimes occurs in redevelopment. So that's a little bit about the legal structure of the plan. The details of the plan will be explained by Dave Roberts and Director Forbes. Just a minute about the process, what happens next. As Councilman Cunningham has said, the subcommittee has been working on this, I think, for over a year. It sometimes seems longer than that. But this is a recommendation from the subcommittee now to the City Council. The next legal step would be for the plan, with any comments that may come from this meeting that may feed into this or not, go to the governing body for the governing body to ultimately adopt the plan. And that has to be done by the adoption of an ordinance by the City Council, which means that there needs to be the introduction of an ordinance at first reading, and like any other ordinance, a second reading, public hearing, and then the vote. And in between those two events, the first and second reading, the law requires that the plan be referred to the Planning Board. The chair is here, for the Planning Board to review the plan and make a determination as to whether it substantially complies with the master plan or is in furtherance of the master plan. Those are the magic words in the statute. The Planning Board then, after reviewing the plan, they have a maximum of 45 days to do that. They can do it faster, but they then make a recommendation or report their findings back to the governing body, and if they conclude that the plan is consistent with the master plan or is in furtherance of it, then the City Council is free to adopt the plan without any further change, of course after a public hearing. If the Planning Board determines that it is not consistent with the master plan or makes changes or recommended changes, the governing body can nevertheless adopt the plan after first giving deference to those recommendations and explaining why they haven't been accepted, and also voting with a super majority of the City Council to adopt the resolution. So that's the overview in a nutshell, and I won't say any more about any of the legal process. I think everybody wants to hear about what the plan says. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Besides a number of folks from Mazer, including traffic folks, stormwater, floodplain manager, engineer type folks, we also had two sub-consultants that helped us with the plan. One is Camoin Associates. They're an economic consultant based in New York, but they do work all across the eastern seaboard and even nationwide. We also had Sylvia Kovacs of Resurgent. Sylvia was involved actually with some of the original resiliency and sustainability planning and concepts going all the way back to the UN. So she has extreme expertise, and we sat with her to go over some of the recommendations that had to do with trying to make this part of Hoboken as resilient as possible. So just a couple of notes regarding that. But as both Councilman Cunningham and Joe and Brandy had mentioned, this has been kind of a collaborative effort over a long period of time, and we think we finally got it kind of fine-tuned to the point where we think we're ready to kind of get your input on it. So the idea would be to, originally was that we met with the property owners. You heard Mr. Marazzini talk about the fact that the council was very explicit that they wanted property owners to be able to have the freedom to redevelop their own property. And a number of things had occurred since the last go-round. I guess it was 2010. It was the last time there was a plan sort of vetted out publicly. A couple of things is that some of the property owners started making plans for their property. So they had applications sort of bubbling to the surface, or they at least had some ideas as to what they thought they'd like to do with the property. Another thing that happened was Sandy in 2012, obviously, which kind of literally changed the landscape in Hoboken and many other parts of the state. So as a result of that, you also have the Green Infrastructure Plan, and you had the Rebuild New Jersey concept plan for Hoboken, both of which were really revolved around planning for resiliency and sustainability. Meanwhile, in 2009, the U.S. Green Building Council came out with a rating system for neighborhoods. Up until that point, you probably heard of LEED. A number of buildings here in town are LEED certified. You see the plaque on the wall when you walk in. But they also have a rating system for neighborhoods called LEED for Neighborhood Development. And that has been something I've had been following. I wanted to get as much involved with it as I could. So I actually took the test and became an accredited professional in LEED for Neighborhood Development. And I try to use that in every opportunity I can when I'm dealing with neighborhoods. And in Hoboken, no matter where you go, you're dealing with neighborhoods. So that became sort of the backdrop upon which we tried to evaluate the proposals. And when I met with the property owners, and there's really 4 sub-areas, and I'll just go right onto that on the screen. As you know, one of the sub-areas is 900 Monroe, and it's already under construction, so you can see it right down the street. But there are 3 other sub-areas. We call this one number 2. We call that Upper Monroe, and that is about 4.15 acres within the boundary. And then, as you can see, the sawtooth kind of nature of how the grids kind of run into the Palisades, and they kind of dead end in the Palisades. The next block is what we call Madison Street sub-area, sub-area number 3. That's 3.51 acres, so it's a little smaller in size. And then there's a kind of a standalone block, which is we call the Jefferson Street block. It comes out one more block out, and it's surrounded on all 4 sides by the street grid. And we call that the Jefferson Street sub-area, and that one is 1.83 acres. So you can see it's considerably smaller than many of the others. So that became kind of the starting point. One of the things I want to point out is that a couple of the other redevelopment plans that had been put forth in the past made reference to a couple of things that go back to the 2004 master plan, one of which is the Green Circuit. The other, in 2010, there was a re-exam report, and that also kind of re-emphasized one of the other aspects, which was the recommendation for a light rail station at 15th Street. So we started out with those recommendations, kind of carried them forward, and then layered on top of that the kind of new paradigm shift that Sandy caused with regard to the Rebuild by Design and the Green Infrastructure Plan. And a lot of that was about the fact that this part of Hoboken was also one of the lowest lying areas of the city. because historically it had been a marsh that had been filled in, and industrial buildings were built on top of it. So it's very low lying, and it has some challenges in terms of developing because of its low elevation, and it's right at the base of the Palisades. Some of the common links, though, had to do with the fact that you had the light rail that runs behind the area, and then you have the street grid that runs into the area. So we tried to build on the bones of that, which is the street grid and the light rail. And that's why having the station at 15th, which is effectively a half mile from the 9th Street station, so that the center point of the Western Edge area would be a quarter mile in either direction from a light rail station. We tried to work around that and build on that. One of the things that came out of Rebuild by Design, and you can see the goals that we pulled out of the plan, and there's really 6 of them. One is to increase the economic base of the redevelopment area. That's why redevelopment is usually done. An area is in need of redevelopment a lot of times because the economic base needs to be built up. To provide a pedestrian-friendly streetscape is a goal that is being pushed throughout Hoboken. Hoboken has a lot of assets that build on the transit availability that you have, and also the street grid. The street grid effectively is about 200 by 425 on the typical block. That makes it already well connected. So we try that makes it pedestrian friendly as well and walkable. To make a suitable corridor for the green circuit. So the question is, where are we going to fit that green circuit in? Obviously, one of the opportunities was along the base of the Palisades. So you'll see that this image on the lower right is really what the vision is for that space that is along the base of the Palisades between the light rail and the backs of these blocks. So that reinforces the recommendation of Rebuild by Design that there be a linear park along that light rail that would also serve for flood storage and effectively absorb some of that flood water in the case of future storm events. That's in Rebuild by Design. And then the sustainability in the built environment has to do with sustainable neighborhood, and that's where the LEED ND comes in. And I have, if anyone is interested, after we're done with the presentation, there's a board here that breaks down the whole rating system. But I'll show you at the end of this presentation where we kind of did a scorecard under LEED ND and said, how would this plan rack up or stack up if it was evaluated based on LEED ND criteria. And a lot of that sustainability has to do with things like effective stormwater management, walkable streets, shaded streets, things like green roofs, all the things that is very much in the vernacular of everything that's going on in Hoboken with a lot of the planning that's been happening here. So that's definitely an important goal. And then maximizing open space, has been a common thread through a lot of what the city has done over the last few years, is looking for opportunities to increase open space. Because again, one of the LEED ND parameters is that not only should you have a mix of uses so that you can walk outside and get the goods and services that you need, you can walk outside and get to a school, you can walk outside and get to an open space opportunity, all within walking distance of where you live. Some of the criticism that we heard about this part of town is that effectively it was a desert when it comes to finding goods and services, that there were situations where some of the development may have had small retail venues on the corners, but the interiors of the block were effectively void of retail uses that potentially would enliven the street, and also provide things within walking distance of folks that were moving into the area. So we wanted to try to emphasize the fact that this was historically an industrial area, but that it's in a period of transition. We wanted to be able to let these uses mix together so that the industrial uses could stay, but new uses could come in that would be balanced between the residential that would be attracted to an area near transit, but also that there would be a good variety and selection of goods and services that would be permitted in the plan. So those are the basic goals, and you can see some of the objectives that go along with that. Encourage mixed-use development with office, retail, commercial, recreation. The other thing I should mention too is that after we met with the property owners, we had an open house. I'm sure many of you were at that open house. It was very well attended, and we also had an online survey that in my experience, was the most extraordinary response I've ever seen, where we had over 1,000 and almost 1,090 responses within like a week, or within 10 days. And it really spoke to the character of the folks in Hoboken and how much they care about their city, because everybody was responding to that survey. We normally don't get that kind of a response. We usually don't see that kind of interest. So that gave us a lot of information. We provided a summary of that at the open house. We got more information at the open house, and it was a very good sampling of sort of public opinion. And that the results of that are actually in the appendix of the document. So if you download the plan, hopefully some of you had a chance to do that. And if you haven't, I encourage you to download it from the city's website. You might want to take a look at the appendix and just take a look at some of the results of that. And that's what we use to kind of build the plan. And effectively, as I mentioned before, there's the main components. This is the green infrastructure plan that breaks the city up into different regions. And the region that the western edge emphasizes retention in terms of stormwater management and resiliency. And then this is a diagram that came out of Rebuild by Design, and I'll outline this is the outline of the city. So the western edge is that green ribbon that runs along the base of the Palisades, and when you blow that up, when that bubbles out, it is effectively a linear park. And the idea was, if the trend is for the water to come up and around behind the city, that this park would allow for as much of that to be absorbed as possible. Certainly we can't prevent every storm, but the majority of the storms we're hoping we can use this park to help build that green infrastructure that will help resiliency in the future. The other part of this, as I mentioned before, was emphasizing the street grid. And you can see the dotted arrows represent the extensions of the street effectively to the Palisades, which runs across the western edge of the city, with the light rail running along the base of that. And this yellow area is our redevelopment area. So what effectively the idea would be to try to create these blocks that follow the street grid of the city. And this is the transit map that you can download right off the city's website. And what I did was I just shaded the western edge in green and surrounded it with the dot. You can see that there are the hub that comes up to the edge of the western edge, the hop line, one of the hop shuttles, as well as some of the other transit opportunities. There's also a bicycle plan that the city's put together that also runs east-west, and really a lot of the emphasis is getting you to the ferry and getting you to the path. So a lot of what this plan is building on is the connectivity of the grid for pedestrians and bicycles in particular. The plan is not to extend the streets all the way to the Palisades, but extend the connectivity of the streets, the corridors of the streets to the Palisades, and then have a linear park along the base that connects to it. So effectively completes the grid for walkability. So that was the other kind of part of the framework. This is effectively what we came up with as what we call a framework plan. This is not necessarily a carved in stone, but it's to give the basic idea and try to put it in a visual manner. You can see that this is the 900 Monroe that's already under construction. That's the basic footprint of it. And that's kind of a given. We assumed that was incorporated into the plan as it's being constructed because it's already under construction, obviously. So we're kind of working our way to the north from 900 Monroe, and you can see the extension of even where the streets don't exist anymore, because in the past they may have been vacated for one reason or another. We're trying to kind of bring the grid back as much as we can. So, for example, 10th Street that runs across the front of the ShopRite would continue all the way to the park across the back. One of the things that you'll see here is that we actually built in setbacks from the light rail. In other words, these buildings will have setbacks from the rear as opposed to what you normally see, which would be setbacks from the street. They would be allowed to come up to the street, but then they would be stepped back as they get higher. And they could cantilever out over the park in the back, so they can make up some of the square footage in the rear by effectively moving the floor plate back as they go higher. And the idea there was to keep that at ground level as much of this land area open so that it can be reconfigured and re-landscaped as a park with flood storage. And that's why you see some of the idea would be that some of the storage would be underground. We're not suggesting that it would be a marsh or that there would be ponds back there. This is really about the underground storage capability that doesn't exist today. So you can see the extension, and also what we did was, in order to maximize the connectivity, we actually provided for building breaks every 200 feet. So the idea would be in this framework plan that you wouldn't see a run of a building more than 200 feet without a break. And the break would be to try to, again, allow for more penetration to that park in the back that runs along the Palisades. So the park is meant to do two things. It's meant for resiliency, but it's also meant for open space. And it's also meant for connectivity because again, the plan strongly recommends that this light rail station at 15th Street be connected to the light rail at 9th via that park and via that bike path, multi-purpose path that would be back there. So you can see that is sort of dimensioned all the way to the north. The one spot where, and this is actually located in the Upper Monroe sub-area, where the triangle kind of gets the narrowest, is where we had suggested that there be more of an open park that would allow you effectively an open access to the park in the rear. And that's in the center. And really what this shows here, at this point, it's exactly a quarter mile to the 9th Street from there and a quarter mile to 15th Street from there. However, we can't say for sure as we do this plan that we're going to get a station at 15th Street. So what we tried to build into the plan was a real emphasis on transportation demand management. We recognize that, and this really came from interaction with the subcommittee. A lot of this input, based on their knowledge of the area, was really raising a concern about if we assume too much about the availability of transit, but we know that the most popular way that folks get to the city is to take the bus, and the buses are crowded, and there's issues with capacity at the Port Authority bus terminal. And we see the light rail there, but we don't know if the light rail is how effective it's going to be. So we may need to supplement, because we're on the other side of town from the ferry and from the path station and from the terminal. We need to figure out ways of getting folks from the west side of town to where those facilities are, and not just totally put all our eggs in the light rail basket. So not only because we don't yet have the station at 15th Street, we think that initially folks will be willing to walk to 9th Street, but the convenience everything's all about convenience and efficiency of time these days. What we want to do with the transportation demand management is make it a requirement for every redevelopment project that comes in under the western edge that there will be a transportation demand required, plan demand required for each one. So depending on the mix of what they propose, of residential and retail, office, whatever it might be, even indoor recreation, whatever the combinations are, they'll have as part of that, a plan that would potentially involve increasing the accessibility for bicycles, bicycle transportation, possibly contributing to adding more shuttle buses to the hop line so that the service is more regular and more frequent, more timely, more reliable, things like that, and also with the real objective of trying to achieve that linear park in the back. So that's become a real important part of this in terms of the transit. So as I talk through this, I'm really hitting on a lot of the points that you would see in the lead ND rating. The green area in the back of these blocks represents the area that effectively the setback that would be created for the park. And then the building blocks that I mentioned before would be they would range between 200 by 100, 200 by 150, depending on the location and where they were at within each block. And then you see that the center point is open. And that, when you add all of that up, you're creating an area about the same size as all of the Upper Monroe sub-area, 4.15 acres, based on adding up the geometries of all the lots. The other thing you'll notice is behind these blocks effectively have lots that front on both ends, the way they were laid out in the tax map. And you can see that some of these lots at one point were fronting on Jackson Street, but Jackson was vacated and is now privately owned. It's all part of this one parcel. However, over on Madison, the Monroe Street right-of-way still exists, so that's publicly owned at this point. So there's more public property behind Upper Madison and more private property here. But that's effectively how that open space kind of lays out, and the idea was to try to connect. There's a plaza that's being proposed behind 900 Monroe by the 9th Street Station, and it would be to take it from there all the way to another plaza that would be right by the viaduct. So you have all the things that have been added under the viaduct on one end, you have the 9th Street Station on the other end, and you have this movement back and forth along this park. So that gives you an idea. It also shows you that these breaks between the buildings, some of them would be intended to get access from the sides, so that you wouldn't have garage entrances on the main streets. They would be from the corners or the sides of the building, and then it would become pedestrian for basically halfway across, into that park. So a lot of this is designed to get you to the park. It's almost like some shorefront communities have the east-west roads that get you to the beach. It's kind of a similar idea. This is really just a breakdown on what we call the floor area ratios. This is probably more something that is of interest to the property owners, but just so you know, we were also trying to strike a balance between the economic viability of the project and trying to keep the project sort of under control in terms of the amount of development that will ultimately be there. The city's been very concerned and very diligent, in my experience, working with the city about not, how much is too much, and trying to make sure that it's balanced with the ability of the infrastructure to support the development, the street grid to accommodate traffic, and all of those considerations that come along with development. So that's effectively what we did, was we established a base, and that base builds in economically the ability to make the projects economically feasible, which was one of the concerns in prior plans, that they couldn't be built and they couldn't be financed. We tried to be very careful to make sure they could be as best as we could. And then there's an allowance for a bonus on top of that, which then effectively allows the city to work out accommodations where they can get extraordinary benefits for the neighborhood and for the city. And that's effectively gets decided as part of a redevelopment agreement. This is really just a very sort of simple graphic to kind of illustrate the idea. This would be the residential, which has a base height of 5 stories above and you're going to have a pedestal because of the flood zone regulations. You'll have a pedestal for parking and retail at grade. You'll be going up above that. And then the idea, you can kind of see the idea of I'm getting a cramp, I apologize. I just realized of commercial that you'd be allowed to build, and then you can negotiate the bonuses from there. So that's why you saw in the FAR that there was a non-residential, a residential, and then a total FAR. So that's how we're trying to structure the development requirements. And then just to give you an idea, now just so that you understand, this is actually just a massing illustration, so this is not necessarily what these buildings will look like, because another thing we tried to add is a great deal of flexibility by saying that you can average the height.
Dave, could
yes.
you just explain FAR in case
yes,
somebody
sure.
in the room who doesn't know what that is?
Yeah, thanks, Councilman Doyle. Floor area ratio is the amount of floor area based on the size of the parcel. So, for example, a floor area ratio of 1 would mean that the square footage of the building equals the square footage of the parcel. So if you had a 1 acre parcel, 43,000 square feet, your building could be 43,000 square feet. If you had a floor area ratio of 2, your building could be 86,000 square feet. So that's how floor area ratio works. And we don't count parking as part of that. It's really the floor area of usable space. So it would be the retail space, the residential space, the commercial space, and so on. But to give you an idea, and you also, so thanks, Jim, for pointing that out. We also have our neighbors to the west that was brought up at a lot of the community meetings, and also we factored in the fact that from past experience we knew that the height of the top of the Palisades was approximately 10 to 11 stories in height, generally. So that was another reason why we were trying to stay true to that as a general guideline of trying not to get buildings any higher than the Palisades. And then effectively what that does is it fills in the space in a way where you can kind of see how the park would work, connecting to the 9th Street Light Rail. And what we show in yellow would effectively be residential. What's shown in red would be the retail. Well, we tried to show in this diagram that the retail would be intended to wrap the corners so that you would have more of an activated space at these intersections where the pedestrians would be walking back and forth to the park. And then the northern portion here, this is the Jefferson Street sub-area, which is sub-area 4. This is the Madison Street sub-area, which is sub-area 3. And the way that potentially would work is if we had the light rail, this is an anticipated location for it. It's right now a parking lot, privately owned, so it would have to be acquired and whatever. But the idea would be to try to maximize the non-residential space closest to the light rail, and the residential would be towards the center, closest to sort of the central park area. This we showed representing the indoor recreation. None of these things would actually necessarily have to be where we show them, but we're trying to illustrate the concept where we're trying to encourage. I think I'm brave enough to stand up again, so my label will lock up. We're trying to encourage the non-residential closest to the light rail, and the residential maybe a block or so in from the light rail, closer to the park. And that's effectively the concept. Just to give you a little bit of, I'll finish up here. This is the LEED ND scorecard that I talked about before, and it's broken up into 3 basic subcategories that was based on the 3 organizations that created the rating system. The U.S. Green Building Council only worked on 1/3 of it, which was the green infrastructure and building rating criteria. The Congress for the New Urbanism did the central part of it, which was the neighborhood design part, and then the Environmental Defense Council did the environmental piece of it, which was the site location and linkage. When you look at site location and linkage and look at some of the categories here, like being adjacent to or surrounded by previously developed properties, or remediating brownfields, or avoiding construction in wetlands, those kinds of things. They seem like pretty obvious things, but they don't always apply. But here in Hoboken, you pretty much get all those points because of you're in Hoboken. This would be like a poster child for LEED ND in terms of your street grid, and historically. And then you go through contaminated sites, transit-oriented locations. You get points for that. So obviously you'd be racking up points a lot in that initial category. The neighborhood pattern design is a little bit more about what you create, not necessarily what you already have in terms of your street grid. And that's where you want to maximize the variety of goods and services within walking distance. And that's usually measured as a 1/4 mile from more than 75% of the functional entries, which is a fancy way of saying you should be able to walk out. Most of the folks that live in the neighborhood in this area should be able to walk out their door and be within a 1/4 mile of a range of goods and services. And that's not always the case currently. And then finally, and there's also things like affordable housing, which this plan, like every other plan the city adopts, applies the 10% affordable housing requirement. And that was built into the economics that we looked at. We assumed that 10% of the residential units would be affordable. So the more units that get built within the redevelopment area, the more affordable housing there'll be as well. That's a given. And then lastly, the parking and transportation demand management is part of this, which we have. Energy production and distribution, water efficiency and conservation, a lot of that stormwater management types of points. And then green building infrastructure, things like green roofs and a lot of the other sustainable types of points. There's also innovation and exemplary performance and regional priority. And I'll show you for Hoboken, I actually plugged in Hoboken into the LEED ND system, and it generates for Hoboken, what your regional priorities should be. And you get extra credits for those. When you plug those all in, under the yes column, what we know we would be achieving, we would already be at the silver level of LEED ND for this plan. If we were able to get some of the maybes and turn them into yeses, which we would do through the negotiation of the redevelopment agreements and crafting each project as it comes through the process, we think it very easily could achieve the gold level of points under this system. So this is really just a way of measuring how the plan would be evaluated based on a known national sustainability rating system. There's no requirement in this plan that the plan will get certified or the plan will even be registered. But we just use the rating system as our sort of our backdrop for how we were developing the plan. And these are the regional priority points. You can see how many points you would get for each one. And when you look at each one of these, you can kind of see Hoboken footprint on it. You have rainwater management. Obviously, that's where the sustainability and the rebuild by design comes in. Mixed income, diverse communities. So you want to have a mixture of market and affordable units, and also have diversity in terms of your goods and services. The street network goes without saying. Transportation demand management is emphasized, which we do in the plan. Brownfields redevelopment, because you're taking what predominantly historically have been industrial use sites and remediating them through redevelopment. And then finally, housing and jobs proximity. So you're trying to mix where people can work along with where people can live, with the idea that you're trying to keep people out of their cars as much as possible. And the more successful we are doing that, the less vehicle mile travel we have, and the less greenhouse gas emissions we have, and so on. So that is effectively the overview. I would encourage, again, I think we have the room for some time, so we'll be certainly here to...
The units are going to be in such, and that's after the plan is adopted, and then we're negotiating with a redevelopment agreement with the property owners. That being said, the non-residential, there's quite a mix of uses, so we definitely recommend that you look at the redevelopment plan online, because we're looking at more than just retail as a base. We're also looking at having, are there industrial arts uses, is there urban manufacturing that's a nice clean manufacturing, doesn't need the space that the traditional manufacturing or industry requires. It allows office space, it allows hotels. So there's a lot of different uses in that non-residential listing that are available and can be used in these projects. And that's why we have that minimum floor area ratio for that non-residential, so that we're making sure that that is built into the projects and it's not just a residential-based project.
And by the way, a lot of the ideas, some of the ideas that are in the plan came from the property owners, for example, and for example, the commercial recreation idea was an idea that was originally proposed by one of the property owners and was sort of validated by the survey. And then the idea of reusing some of the existing buildings that are there. We tried to, in the plan, highlight the industrial heritage of Hoboken and recognize that where there are opportunities to retain some of those types of businesses, we'd like to be able to provide for that as well. So it's not just a kind of a gentrification of the neighborhood and the industrial uses get pushed out. One of the best ways to conserve energy is to not to tear a building down, is to actually adaptively reuse it. So we wanted to make sure that the plan encouraged that. It's not to say that we can make it happen, but we certainly wanted to, we didn't want to make it easier for that, for those buildings to be lost. So again, there's a lot, and there's probably a lot more that I did fail to mention, but again, we're trying to give you a snapshot of what we've been spending quite a few hours working on over the last few months. So, do you want to? Should we open it up for questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Is it 10 stories residential plus the...
No. It would be.
10 stories.
There would never be an instance where it would be more than 10. The only time you could get to 10 is either because you're averaging the heights. You would have to have buildings lower than the base, which would either be 5 for residential or 7 for like an office building or a commercial. If you wanted to average, like you wanted to do 3 and say 10 or 4 and 6, we didn't want to have a kind of a monolithic height. We wanted to allow flexibility, but 10 is the cap. The only other time you would be able to get to 10 is if you negotiated where you were providing the city with something that the neighborhood or the city itself needs, that you're earning the bonus. But even that has a cap. So under no case would any building be higher than effectively 10 stories above the retail. But in order to get to that point, you really have to average, or you'll have to earn a bonus.
10 stories above the retail, so in relation to the buildings that are already there,
Right.
is there a potential that there will be buildings taller than those?
No. I think the tallest one, I think even 900 Monroe was 11. And that's 10 over retail. So there wouldn't be anything higher. And actually, we used the base of a lot of what's already been built up in the neighborhood in the Northwest, which was really 5 over retail. So we're trying to get the sort of the base level where before you start to step back and go up to match a lot of what's already in the blocks that aren't even in the Western Edge, but they're right in the same neighborhood. One of the things we tried to talk about here is because the Western Edge is really only 4 blocks when you kind of look at it based on sub-areas, it's surrounded by a much bigger neighborhood, and we wanted, functionally, it's going to be part of that neighborhood. So we wanted the Western Edge to kind of blend with the neighborhoods around it. But one of the things we recognized in some of that new development that's occurring in the area, other than the ShopRite, not in the Western Edge, it's across the street. Other than the ShopRite, most of the uses are very limited. They might be 600 square feet in corners. So there's voids in between the retail. We wanted to try to, at least in this part of the neighborhood, create that neighborhood sort of retail, street front. Feedback that we got, expressing things that they'd like to see in the neighborhood, not all of which a developer would normally pay for. And then the other thing that was not reflected in the survey is the cost of what will have to be that linear park in the back. That really was an outgrowth of the rebuild by design and trying to accomplish that in this piece of Hoboken that we're dealing with, so that at least along from 9th to 15th, you'll have implemented one of the components of rebuild by design, and that also is costly. So again, we wanted to make sure that we could balance the economics of it with the public benefit of the plan as well. So the 5 to 7 is kind of where we got that five stories for the residential and 7 for the commercial, and it also happened to fit with a lot of the buildings that are already in the neighborhood.
Monroe over here, and during peak hours, especially in the morning and in the afternoon, Monroe Street becomes like a parking lot. Like, it's just cars lined up, emissions, the whole 9 yards, and it's pretty bad. And I think the plans are great for this, but with all the extra residential people that are going to be moving in, that exit way out of Hoboken is just going to get exponentially worse. And what's being done to account for all the extra vehicular traffic that's going to be out there, because realistically speaking, I know mass transit's great, but people are still going to use their cars.
Well, you just hit on...
And people need their cars. So what's the plan for...
Yeah, you just hit on a nerve in a way, because that was a very hot topic of conversation with the council subcommittee, because there is a perception that just because the transit's there doesn't necessarily... And people would prefer to use it, but they don't always use it. So effectively what we did to try to address that was one of the many changes, evolutions of the plan, is we actually went and looked at the traffic studies that were done for some of the applications that involve some of these properties. And we looked at the intersections that they said would be, and we knew that they took a factor, they assumed a certain percentage of the trips would use light rail or bus or whatever. But even with those assumptions, there were certain intersections that they identified in each traffic study that they thought were going to degrade by one category of level of service, and we identified them in the plan. And then we also said that for every redevelopment plan that comes through the process, that there's going to be a requirement that there be a modeling done, similar to what was done recently for Sinatra Drive North, where we were able to study the functionality of the different intersections with different scenarios, to make sure that we could accurately, through a computer model, project out what the traffic impact would be of that project, and then evaluate what potential improvements might be needed to make sure that that project covered their fair share of the intersection improvements that would be needed to distribute that traffic. So that's how we decide, and that plus the transportation demand management, which is designed to get people out of their cars to begin with.
But I mean, I hate to belabor this, but I just don't see how, realistically speaking, no matter what is done, you still have a finite amount of streets. And if you're gonna add all these other residential buildings, there's no way that Monroe Street, Madison Street are gonna be able to handle that volume.
Well,
It's just common sense.
Right.
I mean, I don't care about what study you do, whatever it is, it's a common sense approach. I mean, there's a limited amount of streets in Hoboken. And as we continue to add more and more buildings that continue to go up, it's just an impossible thing. It's a self-defeating task. It's like, how do we manage that? Like, what's the solution? Do we realign directions of streets? Like, how do we handle this?
Yeah,
Well-
and that's what will be evaluated with that traffic model, and that's exactly what we just did that at the planning board with an application on Sinatra Drive North, and what was going to be the better option for the direction of that. So those are exactly the things that will be looked at in that modeling that David's mentioning.
Want to be the
One, talking about the height, attending all these meetings and listening about all these plans, et cetera, it seems that, I agree with this comment, it seems like most of the residents are really concerned with buildings, and developers attempt to constantly go higher and higher and
Right.
higher. And the response is always same, well, it's economics, and here's the trade-off, if you want all these things, then, you've got to give them more height. My personal opinion, I think, if you ask a lot of people, I think they would agree, if that's the question that's posed to community, you can choose between giving developers height and getting amenities, or making them scale down and not getting amenities. I think a lot of people will say,
Yeah.
we'll rather scale down and not get these amenities, because we don't think trade-off is worth it, number one. Number two, one thing that wasn't touched here, in terms of developing these new units, are they mostly going to be residential or rental? 900 Monroe just went up, that added 120, 130 more rental units. I think a lot of us, I moved to Hoboken because I like living here, my kids go to public school here, I would like to stay here. But I think if we keep adding these rental units, you're encouraging transient community. You're trying to compete with downtown Jersey City. You're never going to win that fight, or with Fort Lee and Edgewater. And is there something that's being done? Affordable community apartments are great, but is there something that's being done to encourage maybe bigger apartments so that
Yes.
families can stay in town?
Yes, this plan actually requires a minimum of 10% of the units have to be 3-bedroom units, and they have to be an average size of 1,500 square feet. All of the units have to be an average size of 1,000 square feet. So we do have that in addressing that issue. That's definitely something that the subcommittee members have pushed, and it's a concern thing that they also want to make sure that we're keeping families here. As to the point about whether it's rental versus owner occupied, at the redevelopment plan level, we're not stipulating that. Those are things that come down to the economics of an individual project, and that would be something that we're negotiating and discussing once a plan's adopted and we're talking to an individual property owner and negotiating a redevelopment agreement. That's where we look at is there going to be a mix of that, or how much of it's going to be owner occupied versus rental. But at the plan stage, we don't put that into that. This is just giving the framework of how much residential is going to be allowed. And then that will be negotiating the redevelopment agreements.
That is really driven by, again, this is totally a voluntary plan. The idea is to set the outline for development in the future, and then the property owners would respond. Some of these property owners have already had plans before the zoning board. So they're anxious, and they're all here tonight. They're anxious to get started. So, but they will, once the plan is in place, and is fully able for them to respond to, then we would expect that they would start to talk to the council about a redevelopment agreement, and then move into the planning board. So
So is
I
that
would
a
say-
5-year project?
I
or-
would say some of them would
10-year
would love
project?
to have their approvals much sooner than that.
Right. Just to give you an idea of once a plan is adopted, so we're looking at, we have to do the introduction, it goes to the planning board for their review and comment, then it's either amended based on those comments, or it's adopted by the city council. At that point, property owners can submit what we call a pre-submission form to ask to be conditionally designated and to enter into those negotiations of a redevelopment agreement. Those negotiations can be, it depends on the complexity of the project that they're proposing, and it can be, as short as a 90 to 120 days, or it can go on if there's more intricate details that need to be worked out, but that's negotiated. Once that redevelopment agreement is then approved by the city council, and of course the property owner, then at that point, they can go to the planning board and get the planning board approval, and once they do that, they can build. But it is, as Dave mentioned, it's going to be up to that property owner and what their time frame is, and how much, how they want to move forward on that.
If you could possibly discuss the concept of the cantilever buildings,
Okay.
vis-a-vis the minimum height before you would allow it to protrude, and what would be the maximum length of the protrusion from the base?
Well, basically what we're doing is, I'm trying to find this one would be this would be the residential one. What we're trying to do is step it back from the street, and then it would step over. Basically, you're sliding that floor plate 10 feet away from the street and over the rear. So I tried to show it in that outline, that kind of the dotted line that kind of squares it off, represents the front and the back of the base walls. So as you go up, in this case the residential, as you go up, it's really the 6th floor. You go in 10 feet, you go up 3 floors, you go in 10 feet, you go up 2 floors, and you're capped out at 10. So.
And how would this affect, it appears that there's a watershed there?
That's, that blue area is really just to represent, it's a graphic to represent underground flood storage. It's not, there's not necessarily going to be water there. But
Could you possibly discuss the underground flood storage? Because one thing I learned was where there's water, there's usually mosquitoes and disease.
well,
So how are we going to?
it would be, the
deal
idea
with
would be
this?
underground storage. So what the Rebuild by Design had
Is underground
contemplated,
storage a tube, or it's just rocks and gravel?
it probably would be the latter.
Rocks and
Like-
gravel.
right.
So
would-
therefore,
it would-
more rain, it does come up.
Right. It would be designed to.
And the cantilever, not too much sun between the palisades and the buildings, so it wouldn't dry out. Henceforth, I question about the mosquitoes and the disease.
Well-
Because they are for real problem, especially with children in all the schools everywhere around here, and especially if you're proposing a park there,
Mhm.
it could be a health nightmare.
I-
So my issue is saying it's underground, when all you're putting is gravel there, and then you're covering it up,
With
so the sun
landscape.
can't dry it.
If I made it
Cantilever
to go
buildings.
to go into more detail,
Yes,
that's
please.
actually engineered. So we would be making sure, and I think that that's
I
an
love
excellent,
engineering, and
it's an
you
excellent
can be
comment.
as specific as possible.
Right.
I truly appreciate
We,
it.
we have some examples of where we are doing that stormwater, we're doing stormwater detention. Block
And where would that be?
Block 12 is a prime example. We're designing that right now, about ready to go
But
out
it's
to
not in
bid.
place.
And it's not in place, but there
Okay.
are a lot of locations in Hoboken that are private developments where they did that stormwater detention underground. What it does is it collects and it holds
The
underground.
stormwater detention actually happens to be concrete vaults underneath.
Not
And-
not necessarily. This is
The
actually.
ones I've seen are.
Okay.
We're talking about bioretention.
I'm just gonna let you know,
varieties.
we're definitely gonna take your concern, and as we, because
Can
we're
you
not
be
at
as
that point of,
specific as possible at the
we're not
meetings?
getting to that point of designing these projects. Those are the things that the applicants, once a plan is in place, they're gonna come in with that application. We're going to make sure that that's engineered in such a way that it's not going to have those issues
So
of
you're
the
going
standing
to
water.
cede the water retention issue to the developers rather than the city?
It's not ceded to them.
You said it was
It's,
up to the
we're not,
developers.
this is a plan, this is looking at it conceptually, this is not looking at the details of a specific development or project and how it's being engineered. That happens at the time of the redevelopment agreement. So at that point,
So we have to pass this and then just assume that the city council will do a great job of negotiating an agreement with the developer so we don't have a swamp back here?
Well, that's, again, the redevelopment plan is an outline for the land uses and development requirements for the area, but the actual design of the park is a whole nother scope of work. And that's
But
going to be,
it's
that's
not
going to have to come
incorporated
later,
into the plan.
not into the redevelopment.
So you can pass a redevelopment plan,
Yes.
and the park issue, which is the reason for passing this, gets kicked down the road?
I think the key thing is focusing on the concept of whether the park that was recommended in the green infrastructure plan and rebuild by design and everything else, the linear park along the light rail, is something that's desirable or not. We based on everything that's gone on before this plan, built upon that as something that was desirable for the city. It was recommended by all of the experts that provided for that as a resiliency measure as part of the city's resiliency plan. So, but as far as designing that, you don't design the park in the redevelopment plan. You provide for the concept and requirement for it. So we're going to require the setbacks and the space that allows for it, but the actual construction and design of that park is not something that you would put in a redevelopment.
BASF site. BASF owns this property here, this here, and this here. And the city is actively in negotiations for purchasing this for park space here. This is the PSE&G substation. This right now is being remediated. That will be become city-owned property. At this point, there are no plans for that. That being said, these are this will be the park area. In next to that is the northwest redevelopment area, which seems to wrap around where the western edge is. It includes the cinema up here, ShopRite down here, the residential that has been built up, like you were mentioning, in the last decade. So that's what's around here. What Dave Roberts is mentioning is we're looking at this being lead ND. This is neighborhood design. We're making sure that it's not just one type of use where then people, as you mentioned, have to get in their cars to go to the other uses. And that's why we're incorporating, back to that point of we're having a minimum amount of commercial and retail space that has to be provided in this area so that it is keeping that active streetscape and it is bringing the additional jobs and services and goods to the area. And it will serve, as David mentioned, more than just this particular redevelopment area. It will serve that entire neighborhood.
Yeah, as you look in the plan, there's one of the sections on the economic evaluation. It gives you the basic breakdown of how much commercial versus how much residential would effectively equate to those base floor area ratios, and it's a considerable amount of commercial. One of the things we wanted to try to make sure of is that with the property owner proposals that we evaluated, there was a considerable amount of commercial in each one of them. Considerably more than we had seen really in many projects that we looked at anywhere else in town. The question we had was, if everyone built the amount of retail that they were, and office that they were proposing, could the market support it? And that gets to, that's where that balance comes in terms of the goods and services that are needed in the neighborhood, the amount of additional residential walking wallets, if you will, that will be using that retail, and is there a balance? And effectively, we got to a point where even though we put the residential in as minimums, the square footages that we were talking about were what our marketing consultants felt was able to be absorbed given the balance of residential and retail in the plan. Not just for the folks that are leaving town now to purchase goods and services that would effectively be able to purchase them in the neighborhood, but the additional folks that would be coming in with what they could support economically. So, it's a lot more retail in a particular part of Hoboken than has really been seen in new development in quite a long time. And that was,
Did the cut-throughs require a cut-through in
No.
the existing building?
No.
Or did they go with natural cut-throughs?
it's a great question.
And they don't affect.
It's a great question because how would we do both?
Right.
You would, where there's existing buildings that would be retained, they would have to be retained as they are because most of them probably wouldn't be able to survive being broken up. But on blocks where they would be proposing to build from scratch, we would require at least so the breaks are planned into those building blocks of 150 by 200 or 100 by 200 or whatever. And that's really, and it's a great question, because if you were to retain some of those industrial buildings, you can kind of see where they are in the graphics, you wouldn't have the space for the park in the back. So that's why this is going to have to evolve property, block by block, property by property. We don't know how many economically, how many of those industrial buildings will be retained, how many of them may be added onto, how many of them may be compensated by going higher next to an existing building that may be retained. But the plan, we tried to anticipate flexibility so that there would be options for every property owner to make those happen. So, but it's a great question.
We have a severe open space deficit in this city. And notwithstanding the fact that we hope to have that parcel at the ASF, we're still probably 50 acres below what the standard is for our population, and our population is continuing to grow. So my concern is that it sounds like we have 4.1 acres, and I'm happy to see that the improvement from the last version of this plan is that you might actually have a greenway that means something. It's not just a strip next to the rail station. But if you have 4.1 acres, I'm curious to find out what your baseline density might be, and then what your bonus density might be. And I realize that some of this is going to come down to negotiation, but you've obviously worked out bedroom units as a percentage. Do you have any idea what the number of people that are going to live in the buildings might be, range-wise? And I say that for one more reason. When it comes to the trade-offs, we were asked, would we like, we would love this, we'd like this, we'd like this. But I think there is some merit to the idea that people might think differently when they really see what gets proposed here in terms of what amenities and how much space those amenities and how much they cost. And so, but for me, this idea of the increase in population and whether or not that's going to further increase the problem we already have with open space is very important to me. Not just for this neighborhood, but for the entire city's, open space that's.
Right. We had some general numbers that were came out of some of the applications that had gone to the zoning board. For example, there were two of them. Two of the sub areas went to the zoning board, so we had those applications to evaluate, and they were on the order of somewhere between anywhere from say 180 or 200 to 400 in that range. Units, yeah. But that was based on their specific proposals, based on their bedroom breakdowns. And in many cases, their bedroom breakdowns, for example, the 3 bedrooms were very small percentage. So we're actually increasing that significantly. I think maybe, I don't remember precisely, but I think their 3 bedrooms might have been in the 3 or 4% range, if I'm not mistaken. In some of the applications, we're requiring 10%. So that's going to reduce the number of units because they'll be bigger. So I can't really give you, we just based it on square footage because the economic performance that were done were based on square footage and the dollar per square foot for residential, dollar per square foot for retail, and assumed lease rates, and that's how we were trying to quantify as best we could. There's no crystal ball, but try to quantify as best we could what would be the right mix that could where the retail could be supported and would be viable, and what would be the financeable a level of development that a bank could actually give a loan out for, and then establish a base and then work up from there. So if they wanted to go beyond that, they'd have to earn it through the give-backs or the amenities or things like parks, contributions to the HOP system to make it more effective, their own transportation shuttles, whatever seemed to work best for that project with that mix of uses in that location, given the the street grids and how the traffic will impact roads going out of the area, into the area, where the intersections might need improvement. All that is really going to be depending on what exactly gets proposed within that framework. And then what we try to do is we require the transportation demand management as mandatory in the plan. So they have to anticipate that they're going to try to come up with a plan for getting people out of their cars on bicycles or in transit or on buses or on light rail. And then also the the issue of parks and open space is part of that negotiation as well. So that was the best we could do to try to get balance.
But in all honesty,
Day since we filed our zoning application for the bowling alley and other parts of that mixed-use development. And I'm glad to see we're getting some traction on this. But my real observation was that, given the concerns of height and traffic and density of population, if this plan is not accepted or approved by the city council, could you just review what I, as an owner of that property, can do in terms of FAR, in terms of height, in terms of density on these sites?
Well, again, it would be, the existing zoning would be industrial, so.
But it's a certain number of feet off the floodplain?
Yeah.
In the plan itself, it actually has that existing zoning in there, so if you
But it's 80 feet above the flood zone. It could be 75% of the lot coverage without any necessity to have any green space or flood remediation other than